You're asking the community, what do you want to do together? And you realize that they've never been asked that question before. So that question requires a level of creativity and imagination that has not been a part of their community design for as long as they can remember.
You're now listening to In Praxis, a podcast from the Praxis Project created to support, hear from, and uplift the stories coming out of the ecosystem of base-building organizing. An ecosystem that includes frontline groups building community power and the folks who help support their important work. In Season 3, our host, Blair Franklin, is exploring community-driven strategies for food justice. Our guests are incredible community organizers working to advance fair farming practices, community-led urban farming, and equitable food procurement and retail. These are their stories about how we feed our communities with healthy, culturally appropriate, fair, and affordable food, and build community power to advance health equity through food justice.
Carleton, thank you so much for, just being a part of the In Praxis podcast. Really appreciate having your voice and perspective as a part of the conversation around food and health justice. And so just would love for you to just start off by telling us a little about who you are and what you do.
Great. Well, thank you for the invitation. I'm really excited about this conversation. My name is Carleton Turner. I live and work in Utica, Mississippi, which is on the land of the Quapaw people, the Choctaw, the Natchez, and the Yazoo. My family has been in this particular community for 8 generations. And the work that I do is I am the co-founder and co-director, lead artist, there's a lot of titles, with the Mississippi Center for Cultural Production. Mississippi Center for Cultural Production is an organization that was founded in 2017. And the organization was organized to support groups and individuals that are creating both social, economic, and cultural transformation, looking for towards long-term sustainability through the research, creation, and presentation of arts, culture, and agriculture. So to put it short, we're into improving the conditions of our community using food story as leverage points.
Thank you so much. It's beautiful. And the connection to food and story as leverage points. Can you talk a little bit about what led you to start doing food justice work? What led you to this space?
Well, I had to start with a story. My family, as I said, has been in this particular community for 8 generations. I consider the history of the town of Utica to run concurrently with the history of my family being in the state of Mississippi. So my family, parts of my family are came up from the South, from Louisiana into Tylertown and into places north as this area of Utica, Lebanon, Learned area of Mississippi. Other parts of my family came over from Albany, Georgia, by way of South Carolina, Charleston, and into the same area of Learned, coming with plantation owners that were running cotton and doing that work. So my family has a history of agriculture that is synonymous with the history of the town of Utica. And when I grew up with my mother and father. My mother's from this community, grew up here, started chopping cotton at the age of 5. My father's from Harlem. His family came to New York by way of North Carolina, Hendersonville, and Charleston, South Carolina. So tracing both sides of my family, both my mother and my father go back to Charleston, South Carolina, and into Mississippi by the way, roundabout ways of Harlem and coming across in the mid 1800s. So I grew up on a farm, grew up between my mother's house, my parents' house, and my grandparents' house. My grandfather was a farmer. And, you know, when I grew up as a young boy, he operated a small farm. He grew acres of peanuts, sweet potatoes, watermelon, corn, peas. He also had cows that he would milk daily. He had pigs that he would slaughter and cure hams and bacon in his smokehouse. He had chickens that my grandmother would kill on a regular basis and cook chicken or use the eggs daily. He had a host of other turkeys, and it was just a small farm. So most of the food that we ate came from the land. It came from either the immediate 2 acres that they lived on or the acreage that my mother and father lived on. So basically everything that I ate came from the land that I lived on. And that wasn't a rare occurrence in our community. Our community was an agricultural community. So, fast forward 40 years, I know I'm taking a long time to tell this story, but fast forward 40 years and my community that we're creating their own food was a regular occurrence now doesn't have a grocery store and has to travel 40 miles round trip to get access to fresh and healthy food. So for me, as we were thinking about this center and about creating a place of community development, we knew that the food system was the center of our issues. Mississippi has both a wealth of amazing fertile ground and has the worst health statistics in the entire country. Obesity, high blood pressure, heart disease, diabetes, infant mortality. Mississippi leads the country in all of these vital, terrible statistics. And we also have some of the most vital agricultural land in the country. So I saw this as a personal issue and as a community issue to both change the dynamics of our local community, how we access food, how we think about cultural production, and have that as a leverage point to think about our overall community health and wellness.
Wow. Yes. Thank you so much. And for starting with a story, those stories are critical and just help to paint such a important, detailed picture of what led you to where you are now and what food access, food justice looks like in your community more broadly. You talked about Utica not having a grocery store and that food access is primary issue, right? Primary concern. How were folks accessing food? Without a grocery store in Utica, what did that look like for folks?
Well, when we first started this work, we were working with some working assumptions. So we had some thoughts about what was going on in our community that we were experiencing ourselves, but we wanted to make sure that our experience wasn't just a singular experience, that it was an experience that was something that the community was sharing. So we began working with a group called the Gulf Coast Community Design Studio. And their job as architects and designers was to help translate community conversations into programmatic and physical structures. And we were the organization by which that work was happening. And so we asked our community in our first series of gatherings to look at a map of our kind of like larger community, the Utica community, like the Tri-County area that includes Hinds County, Copiah County, and Claiborne County, and to do a mapping exercise with us. And we asked them to map 4 things on that map: to map where they live, where they work, where they shop, and where they worship. And so what they found out and what we were kind of like, what acknowledged, what validated our thoughts was that these maps showed a center point and basically these lines drawn out to all of these other points outside of our community. So what we came to the conclusion with our community about is that our community, which used to be a hub of activity, a hub of production, a hub of agriculture and of learning and education, has now become a bedroom community. That the thing that most people do from Utica, in Utica, is sleep. And that the other parts of their lives, the place where they work, the place where they shop, the place where they worship, are all outside of our community. So what was important about that was to begin to understand that people are basically doing the same thing they were doing when I was growing up, which is shopping where they work. They get food where they work. So if you're working in Jackson, you shop in Jackson. If you work in Crystal Springs, you shop in Crystal Springs. The same thing for Byram or for Gibson or for Clinton or Vicksburg. People don't work in Utica, so there's very little shopping in Utica. And it's part of the reason why the grocery store left. But the grocery store could have stayed. It just found itself to be more profitable if it moved to another location. So that's, in a sense, our community is getting food where they work. So if they're working outside of the community, that's where they're accessing their food. But we're trying to shift the community identity. One of the questions we asked them was, we now have assumed the role of a bedroom community. Is that a role that you're content with holding? And most of the community said no. And so we asked them, what role do you want to play as a community? And then how do we backwards engineer from that to building a plan from where we are today to get to that place?
Wow. Yeah. And so I love just that process. It's so rich and just like, yeah, the mapping exercise where you live, work, shop, worship. And again, kind of come back to story, right? I think like that tells the story of like, yeah, who a person is, where they're going for their basic needs to get fed, to get healed, all the
Mm-hmm.
ways. What you mentioned shifting community identity, and part of the conversation was shifting community identity from a bedroom community to a new identity. What was the identity folks were hoping to gain or to move toward?
I think we're still in that discovery process. I think the community is still in that discovery process. One of the challenges that we've acknowledged very early on in the process is that a lot of the issues that I just laid out, not having a grocery store, the grocery store left in 2014. So we're now 7 years into, almost seven. The grocery store left in November, right before Thanksgiving. And we have some really interesting stories about people talking about trying to put together that Thanksgiving dinner the year that the grocery store left, because it changed their relationship to food. But going back a second, we're in this process of discovery. So we're trying to figure this out with the community. We're still trying to just map how the community wants to identify itself. But one of the challenges that we face is that the grocery store left in 2014, but what really preceded the grocery store leaving was the closing of the shirt factory, which employed 100 women, that was directly across the street from the grocery store. Those women made the decisions about what would be eaten, what would be purchased, what would be used in that household. So in closing the shirt factory, the grocery store lost 100 families that it served. And even preceding the closing of the textile factory, that shirt factory, was the consolidation of high schools, which closed the high school that was in the town center and relocated those children, those teachers to other jobs and schools. But the children now have to go to school 20 miles away. So you now have a group of teachers, of staff, workers, children, parents coming to pick their children up that were coming right past the grocery store to go to engage in this high school that no longer do that. So you lost those customers. So the closing of the grocery store in 2014 actually started with the consolidation of the high schools in 1993.
Mm.
So having conversations with our community about what that means has shifted and changed the way that they understand the narrative of what the predicament is that we're currently in. So we're still trying to figure out what the identity is. But the most important thing that we can do is, as we're trying to figure out the identity, that we shift the ideas about how we engage from being a consumer to being a producer first. And that's what we talk about when we unpack that story with the community of the closing of the shirt factory, where we were producing garments and actively participating in a larger economy that extended beyond Utica, or the production of educators and the education institution as we produce students and we produce teachers, that those activities put us in a different relationship to the world than we are now, as we're just consuming. We're purchasing and we're bringing back instead of developing and designing and producing from our community. And so that's the primary identity shift that we're looking to advance, is from consumer first to producer first.
Mhm. The interconnectedness that you named, right, of connecting food and the loss of the grocery store back to closing of schools and closing of the factory where folks were able to work and sustain income, and just how infrastructure, like those infrastructure pieces, are deeply connected, and what it might mean to, yeah, just like believe in and invest in. I think you mentioned earlier, just like the fertile ground that's already there, underneath folks' feet, and being a producer first. That's, yeah, just like beautiful context. You talked about some of this work, right, and addressing community needs, building community power, looking like being engaged in these conversations, engaging in being a producer first. Are there other ways that you've seen community power built through these conversations and through the work of the center?
Yeah, well, I would like to see and understand what role we've played. I would say that since we've started these conversations in 2017, there have been a number of businesses started in the town, mostly food related. There's been stores for food, restaurants, mostly not the healthiest of choices. But then there's also been a nutrition space that has opened up, providing healthy shakes and meal substitutes. All of this has happened since we began doing our work. But I don't want to take responsibility and say, oh, yeah, we did this is because we were doing this, that those things happened. I think there's always a synergy that is happening where people are thinking similar thoughts, even if they're not interconnected to each other, if they're not thinking these thoughts together, that people are like, yeah, I've been thinking about that too. So I'm gonna go ahead and act on this idea because I see that other people are also acting on it. So I think just the action of us gathering, of us organizing, even if people aren't directly engaged in that organizing, also still sparks other people to get active and do their thing. Or we're tapping into a larger synergy of ideas that are already, in the community that people get motivated by seeing others in action. We've seen kind of the resurgence of farmers markets coming back to the community, of community street festivals and First Friday events. Again, not taking responsibility for making those things happen, but we've seen a level of action happen in the community that is different from what it was before we started. And we have seen a much larger interest in our community from the outside as people see that we're trying to engage in some form of self-determination within our community.
Yeah, thank you. And again, I think that interconnectedness comes up again, right? And just recognizing that there are so many people and organizing efforts happening, and it's a fabric and a web of just work that's happening in Utica. You're a part of, and community is really naming and uplifting. What are some of the greatest barriers you experienced in this work, and how do you overcome some of those barriers?
Oh, barriers. So I'll go back to the previous conversation that we were talking about, the closing of the spaces and how they connect to the healthy food options.
Mm-hmm.
So when the textile factory closed, and I think it was 1998, there were 3 or 4 of those factories that were owned by the same company, and they closed around the same time. And all of that was related to the North Atlantic Free Trade Agreement, where cheaper labor was found, the ability to get these same garments made at non-union spaces or in places that were not in the U.S. or by, much cheaper labor. Whatever those reasons, the women who worked in that factory had no engagement in the decision-making process that led to the closing of the factory. Subsequently, or, similarly so, the closing of the high school, the decision to close Utica High School and merge those children into the Raymond High School was not a decision that the parents or the teachers of Utica High School had a stake in. Their voices were not heard. It was a financial decision. It was a decision that was made at a board level of the school board. It had to do with politics. It had to do with, the development and building up of one particular community versus investments being made in all communities. So there's a level of access, agency, and equity that were not a part of those decisions that have had generational impact on our community. So I think part of the work that we're trying to accomplish is about engaging our community in a practice of we're involved in deciding the future for our community. So getting back to this idea that we're standing on our legacy, the soil that we stand on, it is our inheritance. It is the thing that we know how to do. It's the ancestral connection to the fertility of the ground and its ability to produce for us, with us, that can lead to a level of both economic empowerment and economic development, but also financial freedom that is different from working for a factory that's owned by a corporation or leaning into or away from the decisions that are made by a board that are not a part of your community that may either decimate or enhance your community. And these are some of the questions that we're faced with. These are some of the barriers is that access, that agency, that ability to be a part of a conversation that ultimately impacts the quality of life that you're able to live and the quality of life that you're able to provide for the community that you're part of. So that's one barrier that we are in constant address of. I think the other barrier is our ability to recognize our power, and so when you come into a community, when you're working with community, and you're asking the community, what do you want to do together? And you realize that they've never been asked that question before. So that question requires a level of creativity and imagination that has not been a part of their community design for as long as they can remember. Nobody's asked them whether or not they want to build a factory or asked them whether or not they want to have this particular amenity or another. What they're usually in is in response mode to whatever someone else's decisions has provided or taken away. And we see this access to the center of creativity and imagination as being a place where our community needs support. Right now, imagination is a barrier. And so our work in food goes alongside our work in telling stories, because in our stories, we hold both our ability to access what has already been possible. We hold the ability to access our own dreams and aspirations and harness that into a community development model that has space for everyone to contribute. And so that I don't want to name that as a barrier necessarily, but the barrier is to get people to be able to be in a place of regenerative and imaginative space, and this ability to dream together, or even dream on their own, like to create that as a community practice. What has been the barrier is that we have not been in that mode, and that our communities have not been set up to support and enhance, community generation and imagination. And so that's a barrier. I think the final barrier is one that, is a barrier across the board for small rural communities, and that's access to capital. The ability to have access to the money that it takes to power a locally designed economy, to where people can have their bills paid, people can have purposeful work, not just jobs, but purposeful work that is advancing values and ideas that are central to the identity of the community. And that's where, a lot of these projects and ideas fall short, is that we kind of know what we need to change the material conditions of our communities, but we don't have the capital to actually see those things to fruition. And that becomes a barrier.
Yeah. So if you had that capital, right? If you had like unlimited resources, framing just all abundance here, right? What would you do to increase your impact?
I think the capital is one thing. The other part is personnel. It's like people. It's a lot of work, and it's time. The most valuable resource is time. It took 40 years for our community to get in the shape that it's in now, from what I remember as a child, in which there was just a plethora of opportunities, of resources, of places for food and agricultural wealth, to being a place that is, kind of devoid of all those things. It's going to take 40 years or at least a generation to transition our community from where it is now to a place of wealth and abundance. And not saying that that there's a destination that we're trying to get to that we can't reach in 20 years, but that the incremental development of our community is a everyday practice. It's not money won't fix it. We can get $10 billion tomorrow and it would divide our community 17,000 ways. But the most important part is that we're building a practice that is generative, is working from the imagination, is building in the type of structures that allow us to grow and expand, not just for the sake of expansion, but for the sake of including and being able to touch and impact the lives of more and more of our community every day. So I would say for us, it's making an investment in education so that young people, we're building a generation the same way that I was built, not duplicating my upbringing, but saying just me acknowledging that the fact that I was able to witness my grandfather and my grandmother live a life that is wholly influenced by the land, that they're working, in an infrastructure that was sustainable, that was as much generative as it was extractive, that it wasn't out of balance. It was, we're raising these chickens, we're able to take these eggs, but we're also making sure that we leave so many eggs behind the hatch so that there's another generation of chickens. That the same thing with the pigs, the same thing with the turkeys, same thing with the cows, the same thing with the plants. That we're gonna, plant these potatoes. We're gonna harvest them, but we're gonna hold so many potatoes back to make sure that we can plant again next season. And that we're, investing in soil generation. We're investing in the water table. We're making sure that we're not wasting. Like, that's a practice. And how do we reinvest in that type of community-wide framework that allows young people to grow up in a system that is not extractive, but it is generative? And that's where I would, if I had $1 billion, that's the type of infrastructure I would be working to help build with our community, is a practice of generative structures and infrastructure for our entire community. And that is the way that we approach community development. We think of our community development as comprehensive cultural community development, meaning that we're not just looking at economics, we're not just looking at agriculture, we're not just looking at housing or health and wellness, but recognizing that all of those pieces have to be present in order for our community to be whole and healthy and well. And that comprehensiveness to community development means that we can be a space where anyone in our community can bring their thoughts, bring their aspirations, bring their dreams, and that we can be a space to help nurture that. Even if we don't have the solutions, even if we can't answer your problem directly, we can help you think about it. We can put some brains on that critical analysis and put some feelers out into the networks that we're tapped into to make sure that we can connect you with resources that can be closer to the thing that you need. And that's just a different way of thinking about community development than the institutions that we currently have in our communities, which are focused on one or other parts of your development, but not the comprehensive.
You dropped so much wisdom and so much knowledge and so much possibility, I think, in that. Yeah, thank you. I am deeply honored to be speaking with you today. I am curious, just what advice would you give to someone thinking about doing similar work, right? Thinking about working at the intersections of art and food and community empowerment and decision making and agency and storytelling. Yeah, just what advice would you give to someone thinking about doing a similar initiative?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say, start where you are. Don't feel like you have to have this entire thing figured out before you start doing the work. I mean, the work is 90% listening. Listen. It's the folks around you, the people that are experiencing it, whatever you're experiencing, listen to that. Connect with people who are having similar experiences. This is not savior work. Like, I'm not trying to save my community. My community is saving me.
Yeah.
It's given me an understanding of what it means to be in service, to be a part of a larger idea. And when we started the work, we came with a set of questions. We didn't come with a set of answers. And I think that that's the important starting point. It's like, you're coming to listen, ask questions for inquiry. Inquiry should drive the way that organization is designed and developed. You can't design and develop a community-based institution without the community. And I feel like if we move in that particular type of way, if that becomes like a value that we hold, then a lot of the institutions that exist that are supposedly serving and providing the daily needs of a community would be out of business because they were designed outside of a community framework. And so they don't actually support and serve the community. They serve themselves. The institution is actually self-serving. And a byproduct of this self-serving is that it provides some service for the community. And for us, what we need are community institutions that are wholly designed by community, and its service is about the community, and the community that it serves are at the table of decision making. They're the ones benefiting from the opportunities, and they're the ones making the decisions about the future. Yeah. And so I would say that value, listen, ask questions and build from the answers that you get. And as long as it's in that sequence, we'll be all right.
Yeah, that's powerful. Thank you. Is there anything else you feel like you want to add before we close?
Oh, I don't think so. I mean, I think it's just the other part I would just add. Yes, I'll add one more thing.
Yeah,
Uh,
do it.
Patience. Too often, our work is influenced and dictated by external deadlines and external frameworks for how change happens. And ultimately, your community is going to dictate that timeline. And that should be the guiding framework. I feel like this work is generational, at least, meaning that it will take at least 20 years to begin to see long-term impact in this work. And that in 5 years, we're just now, we'll be 5 years old next February. We're just now setting the foundation for the work. So I feel good. I feel like there's a lot left to do, tons left to do. And sometimes that gets overwhelming. But I think recognizing that it doesn't all have to get done today, that you do what you can today, and tomorrow you rest, you give your body rest and your mind rest, and tomorrow you do what you can do tomorrow.
Wow. Yes, that is a word. That is a word. With that, thank you, Carleton. You're incredible. Your work you're doing is incredible. The people are dope. I'm so honored. Yeah, just
Thank you.
so honored. Yeah, so honored.
Yeah. Thank you, Blair. It's been great talking with you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of In Praxis. We hope you all enjoyed it. Make sure to visit our website, www.thepraxisproject.org, where you can check out additional episodes with other guests, as well as learn more about our work.